Thank you. Thank you very much to my favorite brother-in-law, Tony Toledo, for the very kind introduction and for sticking to the script. Some people wanted you to say more. But in our family, we have what we call code of silence. Pag sinumbong niya ako, isusumbong ko rin siya. Of course, even if he's not here, I'd like to greet my other favorite brother-in-law, a member of the Rotary Makati Central, Tommy Toledo. And I thank a lot of you for visiting during the wake of his wife, Manang Ellen, a few days ago. Maraming salamat for condoling with the family. The President, Bashu Dargani, the Vice President and President-elect Larry Lopez Vito, my kasibanwa from Iloilo. Marami akong kaibigan dito. I might miss some names, but over the years, I've known way back in UP when I was an undergrad, sa mga senior namin noon, Attorney Rene Valdecantos, mas senior sa akin. My former neighbor and this Governor Joey Benedicto, Mario Cornista. We had our jousts in real estate 30 years ago, probably. Willie Segovia, taga ko na rin kakilala. Si Raj Uttam Chandani, andito siya, no? He's a member. A good friend, dahil kaibigan ko rin yung tatay niya, Albert. Of course, former Commissioner of the BIR, Jojo Bunyag. Jojo, thank you for being a very good commissioner. Mga iba pang mga nandito, of course, si Eugene Yu, mga kasama ko noong panahon ni late Joey Rufino. I miss Joey, a very good friend of mine. I think he was the one who introduced me to the Rotary Club of Makati Central. And I've been a speaker of this club, I think this is my third or fourth time. Of course, the moderator for today, my former colleague in the House of Representatives, a giant from Bicol, Paul San Buenaventura, CPA lawyer. If you want to fix things, mabuti magkatabi sila ni Jojo Bunyag, I'm sure. During their time, they were clashing about, because of course the role of Paul is to lower the taxes and Jojo would be to increase the taxes. The dynamics of tax collection. At marami pang iba, I'm sorry, no? I was asked to talk about the South China Sea. Some people would call it the West Philippine Sea, but the West Philippine Sea is a part of the South China Sea, as you can see here. The West Philippine Sea is that part of the South China Sea, which is claimed by the Philippines. And actually, you can see from the chart here, the South China Sea goes all the way to China and all the way down to the Indonesia, Malaysia area, and Vietnam and the shores of Brunei, and of course the shores of the Philippines, and touching a little of the exclusive economic zone of Taiwan. And the exclusive economic zones of the various countries in the South China Sea area are defined by the dotted blue line. Makikita nyo, the Philippine side, Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, then China. And the red line, the so-called 9-dash line, is the territory being claimed by China. And you can see that it intrudes within our exclusive economic zone, way within our exclusive economic zone, with no basis as far as UNCLOS is concerned. And I'd like to start by saying that the Philippines has taken a very bold step of taking China to court over the sea row. And if we remember, the newspaper reports last month, about exactly a month ago, the Philippines has taken the step of bringing China before an arbitral tribunal under Article 287 and Annex 7 of the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, or UNCLOS, in order to achieve a peaceful and durable solution to the dispute over the West Philippine Sea. I'd like to emphasize peaceful solution, rules-based, and this has been the position of the Philippine government. And according to Foreign Affairs Secretary Albert Del Rosario, the legal track was made only after the Philippines exhausted almost all political and diplomatic avenues for a peaceful, negotiated settlement of the maritime dispute with China. And I'd like to jump, this is the official gazette containing the statement of the Secretary of Foreign Affairs of the UNCLOS arbitral proceedings against China on January 22, 2013. And I would like to also emphasize that this has been an advocacy of mine even during my early years in Congress, as early as my first term. And it goes back during my Navy days, because I was part of the Philippine team, the Navy group that carried troops and arms and supplies to the islands we were claiming in the South China, in the Spratlys, as early as in 1971, many years ago. And in the announcement, Secretary of Foreign Affairs De Rosario said that at around 1 o'clock that afternoon of January 22, the Chinese ambassador to the Philippines, His Excellency Ma Keqing, was summoned to the Department of Foreign Affairs and was handed a note verbal by the Assistant Secretary Teresa Lazaro. The note verbal contains a notification and statement of claim that challenges before the arbitral tribunal the validity of China's 9 dash lines, the one I showed you earlier, claim to almost the entire South China Sea, including the West Philippine Sea, and asking that China desist from unlawful activities that violate the sovereign rights and jurisdiction of the Philippines under the 1982 UNCLOS. The DFA also issued some notes to explain an aid memoir, as well as an explanation for laymen to better understand this claim. For example, number 1, why are we bringing China to an arbitral tribunal? China's 9 dash line claim encompasses practically the entire West Philippine Sea. We must challenge the unlawful claim of China under their 9 dash line in order to protect our national territory and maritime domain. Number 2, why do we have to do this now? Having exhausted all possible initiatives, we feel the time to act is now. If we do not act now, we will be in default. Number 3, what is the basis of our legal action? The legal action is pursuant to the President's constitutional mandate to pursue the national interest and defend the Philippine territory and maritime domain. It also pursues the policy of a rules-based approach based on international law, especially UNCLOS, in resolving the disputes in the West Philippine Sea. And of course, as expected, China issued 2 days ago a statement that China is rejecting the UN arbitration on West Philippine Sea. China has rejected and returned yesterday the notification and statement of claim of the Philippine government to initiate arbitral proceedings, etc., etc. And sources said Chinese Ambassador Ma Keqing was at the Department of Foreign Affairs yesterday to meet with officials of the DFA Asia Pacific Affairs Desk and inform them that China was returning the note and accompanying notice on arbitration. And of course, but in spite of that, the position of the DFA is that it is on with UN arbitration. And I'd like to quote a blog by Harry Roque, a very distinguished lawyer, who said that China's snub is a lost opportunity to prove its claim to the West Philippine Sea. The Chinese Foreign Ministry, I'm quoting Attorney Harry Roque now, through Ambassador Ma informed Philippine diplomats that they were rejecting the notice to arbitrate This means that China will now snub the arbitration and will not participate in the proceedings. This is truly unfortunate, according to Harry Roque. China has repeatedly maintained that it exercises undisputable sovereignty and rights in the waters within its 9 dash lines, and yet it has failed to explain the nature and the basis of its claims. The arbitration would have been the appropriate forum where it can regale the rest of the world with both its legal and factual basis for its claim to title to a greater portion of the West Philippine Sea. With this latest decision, the world is again left to wonder what, if any, China's legal basis is. The arbitration under Annex 7 of the UNCLOS will, of course, proceed, and that is the position of Attorney Roque, and that is the position also of the Department of Foreign Affairs. The Philippines has appointed a former president of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, or ITLOS, and still a sitting judge in the tribunal, Rodiger Wolfram, a German national, as its arbitrator for the proceedings. The Chinese snub now makes it incumbent upon the current president of the ITLOS, Shunji Yanai, a Japanese national, to complete the 5-man tribunal. In other words, it can proceed without the participation of China. Thereafter, it is expected that the tribunal will sit as the lone judge of its own competence. It will have to determine whether the issues submitted by the Philippines, to wit, the legality of the 9 dash lines, the status of the waters outside of the 12 nautical miles of the Panatag Shoal or Scarborough Shoal, and whether low tide elevations currently occupied by China in the disputed Spratlys group of islands form part of the continental shelf of the Philippines. I'd like to emphasize, the continental shelf of the Philippines is going to be a very crucial issue. China's snub, while regretful, has nonetheless made our task to resolve the West Philippines dispute somehow easier. As in all forms of litigation, an ex parte submission is always easier than a disputed proceeding, and I'm sure Attorney Beldacantos will agree. Now, there's also a statement that the United Nations supports the peaceful settlement in the South China Sea Row, as stated by the Department of Affairs, quoting the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Now, let me talk about the Spratlys so that we can now focus on what the legal and the legal international dispute is all about. The Spratly Islands, the Spratly is part of the South China Sea, as distinguished from Scarborough Shoal, from the Paracels. And perhaps I can go back to our original chart here. The Spratly Islands are the group of those little islands, the small dots very close to Palawan. And you can see in relative terms that it's so far from the Chinese mainland. It is closest to the Philippines, closest to Brunei, and a little to Malaysia, and a little far from Vietnam. There are so many claimants there, and China is claiming all of the Spratlys. There's another group of islands, the Paracels. This used to be occupied by Vietnam, but in the early 70s, this was taken over by China. Then, of course, there's the Scarborough Shoal. You can see the Scarborough Shoal. It's off Manila Bay. So these are the three main groups, and the Mischief Reef is somewhere off Palawan also, about 130 nautical miles from Palawan, from the coastal of Palawan, and about 800 nautical miles from the mainland of China. 750 reefs, islets, atolls, keys, and islands in the South China Sea. The archipelago lies off the coast of the Philippines and Malaysia, about 1/3 of the way from there to southern Vietnam. They comprise less than 4 square kilometers of land area. 4 square kilometers of land area, which is very small. Quezon City is about 150 square kilometers, so you can visualize how big it is or how small it is. But we're talking of a huge body of water of about 425,000 square kilometers of sea. And this is another chart that shows the Spratly Island groups, and you can see it is very close to Palawan. Now, there's an old map. I will discuss this later, that goes back to the 17th century. And this question, the Spratlys is nearest to the Philippines than to any other claimants of the dispute. Where is China in this map? And here are the various flags to indicate the countries that are occupying the various islets, reefs, little islands in this Spratlys area. And you can see the maps of the Philippines there, the map of Vietnam with the single star, the map of China, which incidentally is claiming the entire Spratlys, the map of Brunei, and the map of Malaysia. And you can see that China is involved in so many disputes, not only in the South China Sea. It has a dispute with Japan with respect to the Diaoyu or the Senkaku. It has a dispute with Vietnam with respect to the paracels, and I'd like to tell you that this is a very emotional issue as far as the Vietnamese are concerned, because a lot of Vietnamese died there when China invaded, took over the paracels. And about 70 sailors of Vietnam died in an encounter in the Spratlys in the Johnson Reef area in 1984 or 1985. Now, the 9-dotted line has not only fascinated people but puzzled a lot of people, because the 9-dotted line has no coordinates. I think as laymen, we all know that if you're claiming something, you have to define the coordinates. But in that particular case, until now, since they announced this in 1947, they have not defined the coordinates. It's just a vague red dotted line it's like saying, oh, akin lahat yan. Basta't yung paligid na akin yan, without defining what exactly is the territory being claimed. Refers to the demarcation line used by the government of the People's Republic of China, which was originally a claim made by China during the time of the Kuomintang Republic in 1947, but when Mao Zedong took over China, they also assumed the claim as far as the 9-dotted line is concerned. And here is the history of the 9-dotted line has been used by China as the maximum extent of its claim. However, the dotted lines do not show how the lines would be joined if it was continuous and the extent of area claimed by China. The 9-dotted line has been officially protested by the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Indonesia. Immediately after China submitted to the UN a map including the 9-dotted lines territorial claim in the South China Sea on May 7, 2009, the Philippines lodged a diplomatic protest against China for claiming the whole of South China Sea illegally. Vietnam and Malaysia filed their joint protest a day after China submitted its 9-dotted line to the UN. Indonesia also registered its protest, even if it did not have a claim on the South China Sea, because it's very close to the Natuna Sea of Indonesia. And of course, there are the ongoing disputes. Now, let's talk about the Mischief Reef also before I talk about Scarborough Shoal. The Mischief Reef land grab. This was a topic of my several privileged speeches during the 10th Congress. And Paul was there to witness these speeches. The Philippines once largely controlled this feature. Filipino fishermen used to fish at the reef. In 1994, the PRC built initial structures on stilts here with the Philippine Navy, while the Philippine Navy was not patrolling the area due to a monsoon season. And we discovered these structures, and of course, we protested the presence of the structures. China responded by saying that these are just temporary structures in order to provide shelter to their fishermen. And after a heated exchange, the issue died down. It's only 130 miles away from Palawan, well inside the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. China rejected our protest and stressed that the structures were shelter for fishermen. In 1999, another wave of protests from Manila occurred when China added more structures to Mischief Reef. In spite of their assurances that these are only temporary, this is what they have now. They became permanent, and in fact, the buildings are even bigger than some of the town buildings that we can see in many of our municipalities. And we called it China's creeping invasion, because what normally happens is that if there is a protest, they would move back one step but then when things would quiet down, they would move forward 2 steps. This is another view of the Chinese structure in Mischief Reef. The Philippine decision not to destroy the Chinese structures in Mischief Reef prevented an escalation of the dispute. China has always been prepared for armed conflict when opposed, as is evident in China's defense of reefs from Vietnam in 1988. This is the Johnson South Reef skirmish, which resulted in more than 70 Vietnamese sailors killed and 3 Vietnamese ships sunk in that battle. And then now we talk about the Scarborough Shoal. So when China asserts a 9-dash-line claim, and I'm quoting an article about in Asia Times of Greater China, far from its mainland and close to the shore of some overmatched country like the Philippines, and repudiates any form of third-party mediation, the Chinese action is understandably attributed to some combination of arrogance, obtuseness, and appetite for aggression. Now, what is the Scarborough Shoal? This is a picture of the Scarborough Shoal, which technically we call Baho de Masinloc or Panatag. This may look small, but I'd like to describe that it is 55 kilometers around in an area of 150 square kilometers of a little bit of land and a lot of water. A lagoon with an area of 130 square kilometers. How big is that? That is bigger than 3 times Parañaque and almost as big as Quezon City. So you can imagine the potential of this area if this is used as some kind of a naval base. It can accommodate, you can just visualize how many ships you can put inside Quezon City. That is how big this area is and the potential for military and naval use. The Chinese have been claiming that the South China Sea is theirs because it is named after China. But I'd like to emphasize that it doesn't necessarily mean, no offense to our friends from India, the Indian Ocean is not owned by India. The English Channel is not owned by England. The Pasig River is not owned by Pasig. Manila Bay is not owned by Manila. The Japan Sea is not owned by Japan. And so many other oceans, they're not necessarily owned by what they're named after. And I'd like to cite a 1690 map that was retrieved from the archives. This was drawn by a map expert, Vincenzo Coronelli, an Italian. And you can see from this map that there is no reference to China during that time. There's a reference to India. We used to be called the East Indies during that time, but no reference to China. If China was already present during that time, then there will be a term called Mare de Chin, for example, but no such thing. And if we take a closer look, the Panakot, it used to be called Panakot, this is the triangular feature of the coast of Zambales, was already drawn as part of the map of the Philippines as early as 1690. And China was not protesting during that time. And when we crafted the baselines law of the Philippines, and I had the good fortune of being the chairman of the technical working group that crafted this, originally, we wanted to consider both the Scarborough Shoal as well as this is what we call option 2. Option 4, defining the Scarborough Shoal as well as the Spratly Islands that we claim as part of our base points, and therefore baselines will protrude from the mainland of the Philippines to those base points in Scarborough Shoal or Baho de Masinloc as well as Spratlys. If that would be the case, then the body of water surrounded by those baselines would be considered part of Philippine territory. But when we approved this on third reading in the House of Representatives, the DFA sent a high-powered delegation and told us that this is going to result in a lot of diplomatic complications. In other words, there was strong pressure on the part of the Chinese government, and to cut the long story short, we reverted to what we now call option 2, which is the regime of islands option, considering those features, Scarborough and Spratlys, as just regime of islands, not part of the contiguous territory of the Philippines, and therefore not projecting the sea between those points and the mainland as part of Philippine territory. So that is what we ended up with our Republic Act number 9522, which defined more than 100 base points. But as early as that, in Section 2, we already stated in very clear terms the baseline in the following areas over which the Philippines likewise exercises sovereignty and jurisdiction shall be determined as regime of islands. And what are these? Number one, the Kalayaan Island Group, or the Spratlys features that we claim, as constituted under Presidential Decree 1596, and B, Bajo de Masinloc, also known as Scarborough Shoal. As early as that, we defined it as part of Philippine territory. Of course, this was received with protest from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China, but it was a mild protest, and things became very quiet after that. And now, what happened here was this was started, the whole thing blew up on April 10, 2012, when the Philippine Navy caught some Chinese fishing vessels carting away with part of our natural resources there, like clams and other endangered species, violating what we consider as our sovereignty in the Scarborough Shoal, and this resulted in a standoff between the vessels of the Philippines and vessels of the Chinese Navy. And to cut a long story short, we were outmuscled in the area because they sent a fleet not only of fishing vessels but very large maritime surveillance ships. They are supposed to be civilians, but they're quite big. And they were, our Philippine Coast Guard and even Philippine Navy vessels were no match against their presence. So unfortunately, because of that, they ended up controlling the Scarborough Shoal. This became a focus also in the U.S.-Philippine security talks. We sent a high-powered delegation, Secretary of Foreign Affairs Del Rosario and Secretary of National Defense Bolts Gasmin, to talk with their counterparts, Secretary, at that time, Secretary Clinton and Secretary Panetta of the Department of Defense. And there, we were assured by Secretary Clinton that U.S. is committed to Philippine security but won't take sides in maritime disputes. But of course, we clarified that by saying that in spite of that statement, they will not take part in the dispute, meaning the legal dispute. But the DFA chief, Secretary De Rosario, stressed that the U.S. will continue to support the Philippines insofar as our Mutual Defense Treaty is concerned. So what does our Mutual Defense Treaty say? It says, each party recognizes that an armed attack in the Pacific area on either of the parties will be dangerous to its own peace and safety. And in Article 5, it states, for purposes of Article 4, an armed attack on either of the parties is deemed to include an armed attack on the metropolitan territory of either of the parties. So this one is a little disputable because it is not clear whether the Scarborough Shoal or the islands in the Spratlys that we claim are considered part of our metropolitan territory as defined in the Mutual Defense Treaty. But the subsequent clauses are very clear, or on the island territories under its jurisdiction in the Pacific Ocean. Pacific Ocean, some people think that the South China Sea is not part of the Pacific Ocean. It is, because the Pacific Ocean is comprised of several seas, like the China Sea and the Celebes Sea and other seas, including the seas around Australia. That's part of the Pacific Ocean. And therefore, there is no doubt that that sea is part of the Mutual Defense Treaty. And what is clearer, it's armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific. In other words, if a Philippine-owned vessel, aircraft, or public vessel, or armed forces, meaning the marine detachment there, will become part of the conflict, then it will become part of the Mutual Defense Treaty, and we can invoke it. And that is part of the, you can see from the map of the U.S. Pacific Command, that it encompasses not only the entire Pacific Ocean, but also the Indian Ocean. That is the jurisdiction of the U.S. Pacific Command. The U.S. Senate also approved a resolution honoring our Mutual Defense Treaty, the U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty obligations. Then China issues an advisory through its China Daily And this is now part of what I call the muscling and the bullying. And I quote the China Daily: no matter how willing we are to discuss the issue, the current Philippine leadership is intent on pressing us into a corner where there is no other option left but the use of arms. I cannot imagine how the Philippines can press China into a corner. But of course, this is what we call an exaggeration. But nonetheless, this is what you call a veiled threat through one of its spokesmen, through the China Daily. Of course, our PhilAms are also joining the fray by starting some demonstrations, not only in Chinese consulates, Chinese embassies, but also in various places where there's a big group of Filipino overseas workers. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Winds of War by Herman Wouk. And if you look at all the news items that have followed the standoff in the Scarborough Shoal, this would read like Herman Wouk. But before that, I'd like to show you why it's not only a conflict that is limited to the South China Sea, but the repercussions could blow up not only within the South China Sea, but way beyond this particular territory. You can see that the South China Sea is almost dead center in this map. It is very close to Japan and Taiwan, and the South China Sea is a choke point as far as major sea lanes are concerned. About 200 ships pass through there. I understand that about 60% of the trade of Japan, especially oil, of South Korea, and of course also Taiwan, pass through these vital sea lanes along the South China Sea. And then beyond that, to the east, to the west, will be the Indian Ocean. And India would also want to have presence in the South China Sea, especially with the oil exploration potential in the South China Sea. So India is into the picture. Australia is also within the picture. In fact, they have a tie-up already with they have a treaty with the United States, and they have an agreement to station about 2,500 marine troops in Australia. And of course, the obvious implication of that is that they can be used for a potential conflict in the area. Indonesia is the biggest country in the Southeast Asian area, in the ASEAN, and it is also very much involved. China's Naval Rise by Robert Kaplan in Stratford. What he's saying here is that the rise of China is a real rise, and it's something that cannot be underestimated. And then there's another headline: U.S.-China on a collision course in the Asia-Pacific waters. Again, as I said, this reads like Herman Wouk in Winds of War. Another headline is Pentagon sends more warships to the Pacific. We've heard of this pivot to Asia. This is a new policy of President Obama, as articulated by both Secretary Clinton and then Defense Secretary Panetta, where 60% of the U.S. Navy would be transferred to the Pacific area instead of the Middle East and Europe. And let's see a comparison of the China-U.S. military balance. This was as of 2020. The U.S. had a budget at that time of $729 billion compared to $78 billion for China, or about 10% only. But we have to remember that China's focus is in the South China Sea, and U.S. has to handle a much bigger global area. So that $729 budget is spread around a much bigger area. Percent of GDP, 2% for China and 4.3% for the United States. Active personnel, 2.26 million, most of them land-based, and 1.5 million for the United States. Equipment, fighters, 1,320 for China and 2,379 for the United States. Stealth fighter, as of that time, 0 for China, although they're developing their own stealth fighters, and 139 for the United States. Aircraft carrier, 11 at that time, 0 for China, but they now have this Variag ship that is now an aircraft carrier, although it's not yet fully active. It takes about 10 years for an aircraft carrier to be fully operational. Stealth. Yung nakatago. Parang when you're hiding from your wife, that's what you call stealth. 65 submarines for China and 71 for the United States, 27 destroyers for China, 57 for the United States. In terms of nuclear warheads, this is where the wide disparity is. 240 for China and 9,400 for the United States. So in a nuclear exchange, China would not compare. Now let's look at the military spending. I showed you the 2010 figures, but a lot of people are saying that the way China's economy is growing and the way they've been spending on the military, there will come a time, and this will be sometime in the maybe about 20, 30 years from now, when China will be overtaking the military spending of the United States, as shown by this chart. I picked this up from the book Mega Changes 2050, citing some articles from The Economist. So you can see that by 2035 and 2050, I think a lot of us will still be around during that time. We will see that China will be overtaking, that is the projection. Then some more news, like a lot of movement going on. U.S. submarines dock at Subic. Then in the Washington Post, they came out with this very startling news article from the Pentagon. A stealth destroyer at over $3 billion apiece is U.S. Navy's latest answer to rising China. And they talked about its capability, particularly the rail gun, which is going to be state-of-the-art. It is almost like a sci-fi article, but it's true. It's already being built. And then the statements from Senator Levin, McCain, and Webb on the CSIS report where they're supportive of this move on the part of the Department of Defense and Department of State. Vietnam slams absurd China protest over the islands because China is also protesting. Anti-China protesters take to the streets of Hanoi. This is what I find very impressive about Vietnam, because they're really protesting, they're coming out. But here in the Philippines, our reaction has been very mild. There are more action about the Tubataha Reef, unfortunately, than against China. I cannot understand why. So you see the demonstrators happening in Vietnam. Panetta sends message to China during historic visit to Vietnam. Japan enters the picture. Japan steps up the South China Sea plate. With China on mind, India, Japan, South Korea hold trilateral. Japan and China scramble aircraft for the first time. This is a very recent news, and this is why a lot of people find this a very hairy possibility. I was talking with Joey earlier, and he projects, if I may quote Joey, that maybe the conflict is going to be between China and Japan does not have a small armed forces capability. It can put up a good fight against China. In fact, Japan's Air Force is considered one of the top 10 in the world, even better than the Chinese Air Force. Maritime talks in Japan. Foreign Minister's visit to China. As soon as Abe took over, he immediately sent his foreign minister to the Philippines to talk about the security situation. And you can see that now alliances are being formed. Australia urges UN Law of the Sea approach to the South China Sea claims in support of our claim. But immediately, China warns on U.S.-Australian ties. Now, India is getting involved in the China-Philippines territorial conflict. I don't know, I see a lot of Indian names in this, in your club. Dargani, yes, Dargani, Otam Jandani. So we have a lot of, I don't know where you will be in case of conflict. And China. India, look at India is having a show of force showing their capability. Indian warships to sail through South China Sea. India prepares to counter China's clat with INS Satputra. This is a stealth frigate of China, and they think that this is their answer to the destroyers and frigates of China in the South China Sea. By the way, India has a very big navy also. In fact, they've had an aircraft carrier capability for quite a long time now. One of about 11 or 12 countries in the world with aircraft carrier capability. India, Indonesia back freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and this statement can be construed as supportive of our claim and the U.S. position, because the U.S. position stresses freedom of navigation. Anything that violates freedom of navigation in the South China Sea would trigger a response from the U.S. Navy. Malaysia hails America's move as timely. And then, of course, China upped the ante by setting up their newest city and raises the threat of conflict in the South China Sea. What is this? This is Sansha. This is their city hall or provincial capital in the middle, in the Paracels area, and they're garrisoning this with about 10,000 troops. China takes the glove off. This is the headline when they announced the Sansha initiative on their part. China to formally garrison disputed South China Sea. Has the South China Sea reached boiling point? You can see that the crescendo is rising. And then, of course, they also intervened in the recent summit meeting of ASEAN, where they prevented the ASEAN from coming out with a formal statement, where the statement was supposed to be for a stronger delineation of responsibilities as far as the South China Sea is concerned. At that time, the chairman of the ASEAN was Cambodia. And a lot of people thought at that time that Cambodia was being manipulated and controlled by China. And then the Philippines hits China's duplicity in the West Philippine Sea. ASEAN talks fail over China dispute because of the intervention of China. Of course, our response, we're starting to build up also. Philippine Navy buying 2 Italian warships, so we are into this arms race. I don't know how far we'll be, but better something than nothing. Philippines to bid out disputed South China Sea oil gas blocks. This is what a lot of people are thinking, that a lot of this is all about oil, about natural resources, but of course there's also the military significance of controlling a very vital sea lane in case of global conflict. Where is China taking Asia? China sends first ocean-going patrol vessel to the South China Sea, and again, a show of force on the part of China. This is very recent, where they showed the Chinese frigates and destroyers conducting sea exercises in the South China Sea, and some people are saying that they even entered the Philippine waters. They passed through Taiwan and Batanes, the so-called Bashi Channel, and that's very close to Philippine territory. China's newest and deadliest warship has entered the South China Sea. Philippines initiates legal act versus China in territorial row. This is what I mentioned at the start of my speech. And a sea of troubles. This is an article from Time magazine, which I find a little troubling, because now they're starting to compare Asia today with the situation in Europe before World War II. People are familiar with the First World War, are familiar with the Balkans, with the convergence of so many forces like Austria, Germany, France, Russia, England, and then later the United States, that blew up into the First World War. And let me quote some noted statesmen, former Australian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Kevin Rudd. Like the Balkans a century ago, riven by overlapping alliances, loyalties and hatreds, the strategic environment in East Asia is complex. At least 6 states or political entities are engaged in territorial disputes with China, 3 of which are close strategic partners of the United States. Another quote from the former South Korean Foreign Minister Yoon Yang-kwan. Back then, Great Britain's relative power was in decline, while Germany's had been rising since unification in 1871. Similarly, at least in terms of economic capability, the United States and Japan seem to have begun a process of decline relative to China. Major power shifts define areas in which key political leaders are likely to make serious foreign policy mistakes. Poor management of international relations at such critical junctures has often led to major wars. And Lee Kuan Yew also spoke about the situation, and I quote him, "Will an industrialized and strong China be as benign to Southeast Asia, as the U.S. has been since 1945, Singapore is not sure. Neighboring nations are uneasy that China may want to resume the imperial status it had in earlier centuries. And this is quite foreboding, coming from a noted intellectual leader like Lee Kuan Yew. And of course, the Department of Foreign Affairs statement on China's response to the Philippine arbitration. And I do hope that what we are seeing are just not saber-rattling, because it can be very tricky. Saber-rattling can be very tricky from the military point of view, because it could trigger the real thing. But we are just hoping that these are just diplomatic posturings, and in the end, this will be settled diplomatically. That is the hope and prayer of this representation, and I think that should be our hope and prayer also, because we are not just close to the conflict, we are within the potential conflict area, a flashpoint that has been considered a flashpoint from way, way back, but now it's really heating up. On that note, I'd like to thank you for inviting me. Maraming salamat sa inyo lahat. Thank you so much.